I started responding to the 50 objections that are presented in an article that I recently saw against the existence of God. The first objection had to do with prayer, and that it just, from an observational level, doesn't work. The second argument that's used is very similar to that one. It presents a statistical approach to prayer, that if we analyze prayer statistically, we find that no more people experience positive effects who pray than people who don't pray. And so I thought I'd offer a few observations regarding this particular claim. First of all, as a general principle, I find statistical analyses of things to be very, very questionable oftentimes. You have to be very, very careful to make sure that your statistical analysis has been properly carried out. What are all the factors that are used in the analysis itself. But one of the problems that I have, in addition to that, is that the statistical analysis of prayer assumes a certain time frame, I would assume. Like, for instance, that a person who prays within 6 months or within 2 weeks or within 24 hours doesn't receive any greater effects than someone who doesn't pray or whatever. Assuming that that kind of analysis is correct, does it show that God does not respond to prayer, that God is not involved in the history of the world? I would say two or three things in response. The first thing that comes to mind is that I'm quite confident that the person who wrote this would not feel very good about statistical analyses of other things. For example, from what I understand, the statistical data on the probability of life appearing on planet Earth is enormously small. In fact, almost to the point of it being impossible. So does the statistical improbability of life appearing argue for life's appearance being a miracle? Presumably most movements of matter historically have not yielded life. And so because a very few have, presumably, because a very few combinations of matter have resulted in a living system, so far as the history of geology, the history of biological species are concerned, because most combinations of amino acids and so on don't result in a living system. Does that then mean that the statistically improbable instance would be a miracle? Think about the Big Bang, for instance, the current dominant theory in cosmology about the origins of the universe. The statistical probability, from what I understand, that theorists propose based on the various cosmological constants and so on, the statistical probability of our universe being like it is, a universe that would sustain life or that could support life, is enormously against this happening. Does that statistical improbability then argue for the existence of God to have produced this effect? Is it legitimate then to call it a miracle? No, I suspect that the person who wrote this article, if they were confronted with a statistically unlikely instance of something happening, they would attribute it to some other cause. In other words, they are fundamentally opposed to the existence of God, and therefore any improbable event that might have resulted from prayer, or perhaps prayer over many centuries of time, will never be taken as supporting the existence of God. Let me give you two quick examples. One, Karl Barth, a famous Protestant theologian of the 20th century, made reference to the fact that the survival of the Jewish people through the centuries, and we can say also in the 20th century, the establishment of the Jewish state, is an incredibly unlikely event. You don't have another instance of that in world history, of a people who had essentially sort of left their land, been extremely persecuted, and then persecuted down through the centuries, who went back to their land after nearly 2,000 years of absence from it, reestablished their nation, and revised their ancient language, began using their ancient language again. The statistical improbability of that event happening, when looked at from a world history perspective, is enormous against it. Would that be taken as the instance of a miracle, even though the Jewish people for centuries prayed that God would restore their nation or bring them back to their land? Can this be seen as the answer of a prayer after 2,000 years? I'm sure that the author of this article would not accept that, even though it's enormously improbable that it would take place. I'll give you one other quick example. What about the Catholic Church? The Catholic Church has survived over the last 2,000 years. Peter died in Rome. around 65 AD or so under Emperor Nero by being crucified. His body was buried nearby on the foot of the Vatican Hill. A church was later built on that site, the Church of St. Peter's Basilica, and now it's the Vatican that is there. The Roman Catholic Church is the only institution that has survived from the ancient Roman world into the present world. The only surviving intact institution. Even though there have been some very poor leaders there have been some very immoral people who have been popes. There have been changing world circumstances over and over again since then. Does the statistical improbability of the Roman Catholic Church or the Vatican surviving in Rome, in contrast to all the other failed institutions of the ancient world, does that suffice as the answer to prayer, since Catholics through the centuries have prayed that God would protect the Church and lead the Church? I think not. I don't think that this author would accept that as a miracle, even though it's something that is enormously improbable from a purely statistical standpoint. You don't find any other similar instance of it. So my point is that the statistical thing is based on the assumption that you can put into a controlled setting prayer. That's like treating God like some type of substance you could put in a petri dish, or that you could look at under a microscope in a laboratory and see the effects of prayer like you could see the workings of natural law. It seems to me that that is just an enormously small view of God. It's an enormously unbiblical view of God that is being used here. And I think there is plenty of evidence, if you think in more cosmic terms, and if you think in more more spiritual terms, more theological terms, there are all kinds of ways of seeing that God truly is at work in the world, and that prayer is truly being answered, but it's being answered in God's way, not at the whim of the creature demanding that the Creator do things.